Okay, so here we are with our latest render. For this one, I had to turn optics off in the end. The first one we rendered fine on my machine. This one actually crashed at frame 120. So just to be sure, I went to our system. I turned off our enable optics RT, re-rendered it, and it went through fine. So it took about 25 minutes to render. The previous one took about 20. So you do save a bit of time by having optics on, but again, it can cause crashes with lots of heavy instance geometry. So for this one, I'm going to leave this off from now on. Now I do like this render much better than our previous one. So we've enabled our alpha replace to be 1 for our dome light now. So we have a proper background being seen in there. I like the fact that our little yellow flowers here are now all generally facing the camera a little bit more, and so we can see more of the detail in them. Before, because they were just rotated around, they looked a bit like spheres, but I think this feels better to me. I really like the fact that we've now got more variety here in the sort of timing of our plants. You can see certainly these beige ones at the beginning, they sort of all open and close at different times now, and the same with this sort of bushy blue one. If we compare this to our previous render, let's bring that one up. You can see all of these seem to feel like they were all happening at the same time. There wasn't so much variety in them. So by adding that extra sort of higher frequency noise to our distance attribute that we're using to randomize our frame number, it's giving us a nice sort of granular extra detail to our offsets. It feels a little bit nicer from plant to plant. So this is pretty cool. I think I'm going to go for this for a full render. Before we do that, let's just make a few tweaks to our materials. We can use a couple of our attributes we set up before. And also we forgot to turn on motion blur, so let's also set that up now as well. So I'm going to start by coming to our main scene here. I'm actually going to duplicate our camera because I want to zoom in a bit closer and I don't want to mess up our existing render cam. So just Alt dragged out a new copy of our render cam, hold Y and drag across to delete that. Let's drag it to the viewport, enable our little padlock here so we can move the camera as we move our view. Let's just uncheck that again so we've turned that off. And let's just come to our redshift render view here. Let's come to about frame 55 or so. Let's kick off a render. Let's make sure we're using our close-up render cam 1. I'm going to enable our render region just to focus in on a few plants here. See if we can see some difference in our motion blur. We did bake this out with motion blur on in terms of the proxy, so it should be in there. I think I'm going to turn on our bucket mode here. It's going to be a little bit slower, but it's going to give us a slightly better result. It's also going to be a little bit slower now as well because we are not using optics, but it's a small price to pay for not having crashes. Most of the time optics is great, but just in this case it seems to be a little bit problematic at the moment. So let's store this in our render buffer by pressing this button here. Let's come over to our output, to our redshift ROP, and even though we have motion blur on our proxies, we do need to enable this on our redshift settings here. So let's enable motion blur, let's enable mesh deformation blur, let's reset our render, see if we can see any difference. It is going to be very subtle because this is quite sort of slow moving unfolding of plants, but it is going to sort of smooth things out as we have an animation. So I think already I can see there's definitely some motion blur going on there. If I just save this frame and compare the two, it's very subtle. You may not even be able to see it perhaps there, but it's definitely there now. So we're going to leave this on. Okay, let's close that. And let's have a look at adjusting some of these shaders now. Now, one issue we do have, even if we go forward a little bit more to about 85, you can see as I refresh, the trouble is we're loading in so many different proxies now for all our different frame numbers of our different plants. It's actually taking quite a while to start a render. So every time we press render, it's taken about 10 or 12 seconds to start the frame. Now this isn't so bad when you're rendering overnight, but if we're trying to work interactively here and shade things, we'd like a little bit faster way to work. So what we're going to do here is kind of set up a little, how do we say, just a kind of frame override. We're going to essentially reset our frame attribute just to be the current frame. It's going to look different because we're not going to have all our nice offsets, but it's going to allow us to quickly fire off frames and get quite quick feedback. So I'm going to set this up quickly now. I'm going to come back to our object. Let's go to our setup. Let's go down to the bottom here where we set our frame attribute. And this is where we're varying this frame attribute. I'm going to make a bit more space down below here. Let's grab all these, pull them down. I'm going to hold Alt and just drag across here to create a knot. Let's put down another point wrangle. Let's connect it over here and let's call this set frame attrib to frame. Nice and clear. Let's connect it up to our distance here. And in fact, let's call this randomized distance just so it's a bit better named. Let's also change our attribute remap. I didn't do a very good job of renaming these nodes. Let's just call this remap dist. Okay, so inside this one, all we're going to do is we're going to take our I attribute frame number and we're going to make it equal to attribute capital F frame. We are going to connect this one up. And if we were to render now, I'm hoping, yeah, it takes about 2 seconds or so to load the frame. So because we're now loading one frame for all of our different plants, it's got much less geometry to load in. Redshift proxies are fast, but it gets to the point, especially when you're offsetting things like this, that we may need to load almost all of our proxies in to cover the entire range of all these different offsets. So it's quite a lot more geometry to load in. So this is just going to sort of speed things up. And you can see it's actually complaining here. Got a little green underscore here because frame is a float attribute. We're actually trying to cast this to an integer. Now it does work, but just to be specifically clear, I'm just going to call the floor function, which will just chop off the decimal place and convert that into a actual integer. And sometimes this happens as well. You can see our geometry's gone a bit crazy. If you reset that, just reload the scene, it's fine. Okay, so let's also just quickly create a little toggle that's going to allow us to switch between these two. So I'm going to put down a switch. Let's connect these two up. I'm going to turn off that render for a second, stop it calculating in the background. Now, I think if we come to the bottom, trying to get this to reload. So yeah, so we can now see we've got the little dotted line and the little straight line here. So essentially the switch is going to allow us just to switch between these two inputs. This one should be dotted now. I'm not sure why it's changed, but essentially switch between these two. It's going to switch between our two different inputs here. And we could even create a little control for ourselves. So let's just put down a null. Let's call it control. Let's give it a cool color like blue. Let's give it a cool shape by pressing Z, maybe this little down arrow. You could put a lot of different controls on this and you can connect it to different parts of the scene. For now, we're just going to create a little toggle that's going to switch between these two. So if we come to edit parameter interface, I'm going to hide these two. Not going to want those, just make those invisible. Let's grab an integer here. And instead of displaying as an integer, we can display this as a toggle. So it's going to give us a value of 0 or 1. We can call this frame sync. Maybe the label's just sync to frame. Accept that. So we can have 0 or 1. And if we right click on this, copy parameter, go to our switch. At the moment we have two inputs, 0 or 1. So if we paste relative reference, we can now control this with our little controller here. So while we're doing our look dev, we'll just turn this on. And then when we do our final render, I'll probably forget, but we should turn this off. Okay, so let's leave this on for now. You can see this is now using the right-hand branch, so we're setting our frame to be the current frame. Okay, so let's actually override some of these shaders now. I'm going to move the camera a little bit differently, I think. Just want to line this up maybe around here. Let's go for that. Try again. Might even do a slightly earlier frame. Okay, so you might remember from a while ago that we actually had our original red shader, and then we overrode that or overrid that with our material instances. If I was to turn this off, you can see we've got our original red shader, which I still really like actually. It's pretty cool, but I do prefer this one now, I think. You can see sometimes when you do change things, you do get this weird issue where your geometry does show up. It's going to happen a few times, I guarantee. Just press reset or refresh and it will go back to normal. So we're going to create some additional overrides now for our different plants. So let's take this. This is currently overriding everything, but we can specify a group to override with a different shader. So let's call this one override all. Let's come down and just duplicate this by holding Alt and dragging, connect this one up below. And let's say override A. So this is going to be a control that's going to override our plant A, which was this one here, this little beige one. Just to actually make this even faster still, we could put down a blast at the end. We can use our little group checkbox here that we did before. We'll say @variant equals 0. Group type is points, and we're going to delete non-selected. So essentially, we've just deleted all the points. We just hide other objects. If I toggle this, you can see we're deleting all the points that aren't variant 0. If we come back to our render view now and press render, it's quite a nice way just to isolate your different groups of plants. Okay, so I'm going to set a quick mark here by pressing Control 1. We're going to be diving back to this a lot. So if I press 1 now, it'll just jump back to this location. I'm going to create a new shader. So I'm going to go to our material palette here, and I'm going to drag out a copy of this instances material. Let's call this override A, override plant A. Let's copy this. And in fact, before we do that, let's press Control 2. So this is going to set our quick mark 2 for here. I'm going to copy this with Control C. By pressing 1, I can jump back to our main setup. Press 2 to jump back to the material palette. It's quite a nice little way to set things up. So let's override all of our plant A's now with this shader. So the shader, we're going to paste in override A. Not sure if I've spelled override right. Doesn't matter. Let's set the group, as we did a minute ago, to be @variant equals 0. So this is going to basically say for every point that has a variant of 0, override the shader with this. So if we go back now to our material palette, let's dive inside and have a look. We can delete these spare nodes we're not using anymore. And you'll probably remember from before, we were using our color var. We were ramping it through our color ramp to set the color. And then this was going into our material here. Now we also exported a curve U attribute with our original proxies. So let's bring that one in now. I'm going to put down an RS point attribute. Let's call it curve U, which was the name of the attribute. And it was a float attribute. So I'm going to use not out color, but out scalar. Let's just connect this one to the output of our material node here. This is the actual Redshift material, but this is the output. So anything that's connected to this, it will be what you see on your shader. So by connecting just our attribute, you can see we get the black to white gradient running through our plant here. I'm going to use a ramp node, redshift ramp. Let's connect this one up. It's going to allow us to change our colors. I'm just going to flip this from black to white. And I'm going to pull down our black a little bit more, just so that we've got a bit more contrast like this. So we've now got this white at the base and black at the top. And I'm going to use this as a mask essentially to add another color into our existing color, which was this kind of beigey color here. Okay, so let's make a bit more space by dragging this one across. I'm going to hold Alt and just drag across these two to make a knot. And let's put down a redshift color layer. Can't spell it because I'm English and I use U instead of OR. But redshift color layer is one of the most useful nodes you can use. It's essentially like the layer stack in Photoshop. You can just add colors. You've got a base layer here and you can stack colors and masks on top. So at the moment, if we were to just view this, we've got our colors connected to our base layer. Let's in fact just connect this output to the output of our redshift material. You can see it's black because we have our base layer connected, but we've also got layer 1 connected, which is also black. If I turn this off, you can see we've got our base color coming through now. So let's add another color to this and let's use the ramp we just made as a mask. So I think I'm going to enable this. I'm going to set maybe a sort of desaturated purple. Try something like that. And I'm going to connect the output of this ramp into our layer 1 mask. It's pretty subtle, but if you have a look, if I adjust this ramp a bit more, you might be able to see that we have like a purplish tinge to the base of our plants now. So you can obviously adjust this as you want. This is pretty nice. Let's connect this one to our actual, let's connect our material to the output of the shader now, and we can see the final result there. And because this ran through the entire plant, you might remember that if we come to the start here, start playing through, these ones now will start purple, and as they grow, they'll slowly grow into our sort of beigey color here. Cool, so we're going to go for that for our first one. Let's come back to our main scene, press 1, and let's try our second plant now, plant B. So for our blast node here, I'm going to set our variant to the next one, which was 1, which was plant B. Just going to refresh that. It's got stuck again. Now we can see there's our second one here. So let's put down another override. I think I'm going to definitely add a bit more detail in the shader here. We had our branch attribute that was like a random color for each of these little spines. I'd like to maybe just give a little bit more variation in this. So let's duplicate this, add it on below. Let's call this override B. We're going to set our group to be variant 1. So we're only going to be selecting the points that have a variant of 1. Again, this has messed up our render, so let's refresh that. In fact, I might stop this while I'm setting this up. Let's jump over to our materials, and I'm going to duplicate this one and call this override B. And now we can actually jump back again, come to our override B here, and let's just change the shader. Oops, try that again. Let's change our shader here to be override B. So we've got these connected now, and this one's overriding these points. So let's again jump back to our material palette. There's a lot of diving around here to all the different palettes. Let's press render, and let's jump inside. Okay, so here's our particle attribute lookup. We call this one branch. Let's connect this to our output here. Sorry, this is a little bit small on the screen. Hopefully you can make out. We're just connecting that to the surface attribute of our redshift material. And that's the main output material, not our actual redshift material. And you can see we've now got this sort of random attribute that's running across our spines. I'm going to delete our old ramp, create a new one that's freshly got all its default values. And I think I'm just going to increase the contrast by bringing up our black level like so. Oops. Something around this level. And let's try that. So I think for this one, let's just connect our color layer. This is purple. Is it purple? Shouldn't be purple. Let's try refreshing and see. Oh, that's what's happened. So we've got the layer 1 enabled. So if I turn that off, this is the original blue color. But I think I will mix in a bit of purple again. Maybe something a little bit darker. Something like this. Let's mix in this mask we just created with that. And you can see we've now got little patches of purple mixed in with our blue. And we can of course refine this again, depending on how much we want to change. I want to keep it fairly subtle. Might even take our white and bring the value of that down just a little bit, so it's a little less, well, bringing it down makes it more subtle. Let's go to about 80, I think. Let's connect this one up. And again, it's probably something you may not even be able to notice. Again, I want to keep this pretty subtle, but feel free to go crazy with this, try all sorts of colors. It can be pretty fun. Okay, so that's our second one. Let's jump back to our setup here. Let's have a look at our next variant 2, which was plant C. I'm going to refresh that just so it reloads. This one I actually quite like as it is. I don't think I'm going to do anything to this shader. I'm going to move straight on now to plant 3. This is our little sort of clamshell one. And I think I will add a little bit of something to this. We had that inner mask that we created, which was kind of a linear mask that went from the middle of our shell thing to the edge. So let's try adding that now as well. So we're going to do one more override here. Going to Alt drag out. Call this one override C. It's going to stop the render a second. So our variant for this one, in fact, this isn't override C. This is plant D because we skipped plant C. Sorry. So this is override D. This is plant D. And our variant is variant 3. So let's change that to be variant 3. So we're only affecting these points. Let's dive on over to our shaders here. Let's copy this one out. This one is for plant D, so override D. I'm going to copy this again, jump back, and let's just paste this. This probably has to be the most jumping around setting these overrides like this that we've done in Houdini, but it is worthwhile. It does give you a lot of control and I really like it. So now we've got that connected to variant 3, override D. Let's go back to our shader here. Let's have a look at this one. So this one, the actual attribute we used was called inner mask. I'm going to type that one in. Let's connect that up to our output just to see. And there we can see a kind of gradient going from the middle to the edge. I'm going to reuse this ramp actually. Just drag that into there. And we can use this just to clamp and sort of refine where we want our mask to be. Might just bring up the white again to 1. And let's have a look at this now with our shader. So let's connect our material to our output. So we've got for our base layer our yellow, then we are adding this sort of purple to the middle bit. I think for the middle, for this one, I'm going to go for, I kind of want a similar color. I don't want to change too much. Maybe slightly more orange perhaps. Let's bring up the saturation. Maybe a pink. No, I think that's too much. Let's go back to sort of this orangey color here. As with all of these, it's fairly subtle. If you click on this down arrow, you'll actually bypass this. You can see the difference between the two. So that's without, that's with. It's very small, but it just gives you a bit more something inside there. Almost feels a bit more like subsurface. So I like that. Let's leave that one. And let's go back and let's have a look at our final plant here. Use our blast node just to isolate this and choose our last variant, which was variant 4. Gonna have to refresh once again. And I actually like this one, but I think it's just too overblown. So I think I'm going to just adjust the shader. So let's create final override here. This one we will call override E for plant E. Stop the render. Let's just change this now because we know we're going to call this override E. We want this to be variant 4, so we're only going to group the points that have variant 4 on them. Dive back to our shaders and let's create this last shader for us here. In fact, I want to, maybe I'm going to take our original shader because I don't want to change the shader to what we've been doing so far. I'm going to take the original. So this instance's shader here, let's call this override E. Dive inside that and let's just delete the nodes we had before. Press render. You can check that this is assigned. Let's just try connecting the output to the output. You can see that's working. Okay, so I don't want to change the color. I like the white, but I do think that what we are using for our backlighting translucency is probably a little bit too strong. So let's bring our weight down and reduce it a bit further, maybe about 0.3, something like that. That's what it was before. It's extremely over bright. Kind of cool in its own way, I suppose, but I think it's too strong. So let's go for about 0.3. Okay, cool. So with that done, this is all of our overrides. Let's just color these a different color. Let's go for a pink. Let's tap A and just drag down to line these ones up. And let's have a look at our final one. So I'm going to delete our blast here. And let's have a look at all of our plants together. It's probably not going to be a big change here. I didn't really want to go too far from what we had before, but I did want to show us how we can sort of adjust the shaders using our attributes here. Let's come to our render cam. Let's have a look. And I think this is good for our final render. So I'm going to set this up now and we're going to kick this one off and have a proper look at it. Okay, so first thing, let's change this before I forget. So we've got our switch. We want to set sync to frame off. So it's now using the left-hand branch here, and we're going to set our frame attribute with the proper attribute. Got all our overrides set. Let's come over to our output here, to our redshift ROP. We are going to render 1 to 125. We are going to make sure under main we have the right render camera, which we do. For output, we've got the path correct, which is cool. Under main again, I'm going to override our camera resolution. And because it's the last one, I'm going to go for full 1920 by 1080. Let's bring this down a bit so we can see a bit more. So we've set that, we've set our output. Let's come to redshift itself. We've got our motion blur on. Let's come to our settings. We're going to turn off progressive rendering. This is what we are using to get a nice fast render, but we want to use the proper unified bucket mode now. Now I'm going to use pretty much what I use for about 99% of my renders. Most of the time I just set these values to be the following, unless I've got really heavy depth of field. So I'm going to go for 8, 256. I'm going to set the adaptive error threshold to about 0.012. And I find these are pretty good for like good quality versions for most of my stuff. This sometimes I will raise higher, like if I want a faster render, I'll go to 0.03. Sometimes if you want a higher quality one, you go to 0.08 or even lower perhaps. But I find about 1.2 to 1.5 is kind of a sweet spot for me. Okay, we're also going to change our sampling. You can now, in Redshift, come to your system. You can enable automatic sampling. I personally find that it's a little bit better and faster for me personally, just to set this stuff manually still. So I'm going to do this. I'm just going to grab our max samples. I'm going to copy this as a parameter. General rule of thumb is if you make your individual samples for things like your reflection and your lights and your shadows and your global illumination, about 2 times the amount of this, it's a pretty good way to go. So let's come to sampling overrides. I'm going to enable reflection overrides. I'm going to do paste relative reference. I'm going to multiply by 2. So this is now double, and even if we were to go back and adjust this to say 128 or 256, this will stay in sync. So let's go 256 for this. This is controlling our anti-aliasing, and this is more like our shading samples for things like reflection, refraction, global illumination, things like that. I'm going to copy this expression and I'm going to paste this. We don't have any refraction here, so I'm going to leave that off, but I probably would do that here as well if we had refractive objects. We haven't got any ambient occlusion. We do have light. This is going to be our specular and our shadows. So let's add that to our samples. We haven't got any volumetrics, we haven't got any single scattering, and we haven't got any subsurface multi-scattering. So it's fairly straightforward. Let's come to our global illumination. We've got this set to brute force, radiance point cloud. Leave it at 5 for the number of bounces. It's just the number of times the light can bounce around. And the brute force GI rays, this is essentially the same thing as your sampling overrides, but it's just for the GI. So let's paste this in here as well. Unified max samples times 2. It's not perfect, but I find these settings kind of work most of the time for me. Okay, finally, let's make sure under system that we have also disabled our optics, which we have because I don't want to crash my machine. So with this done, we're going to set off the final render and then we will come back and have a look at this. So I'm going to do that now.